Hello and welcome to Bitcoin with Jake. Today I'm speaking with Farida Bemba Naburema. I'm hoping I've said that correctly. Farida, welcome.
You say it correctly, Jake. Thank you very much for inviting me to your podcast.
No, it's a pleasure. I'm very excited to hear about your story, actually, Farida. So I always begin in the same way. Could you please explain to those that are listening the projects that you're involved in the day-to-day at the moment? So your present role, whether that may be a job or whatever personal kind of side projects you're involved in. And after we've covered kind of where you're at today, we'll look at how you came about in that sense. So how did you end up at this point?
I think it's a pretty long list. I am the executive director of Togolese Civil League, which is a non-profit organization that was created 6 years ago by members of the Togolese diaspora that wanted to support civil resistance in Togo. And prior to that, I was the co-founder and the spokesperson of the FOMASCO movement, which was created in 2011 with the ultimate goal of bringing an end to the military regime that rules my country, Togo. Togo has been ruled by the same government since 1967. The father was president for 38 years. When he died, his son took over. Which makes Togo the oldest military regime on the African continent. So we have been facing extreme dictatorship for multiple decades, 5 decades more precisely. And that led us to wanting to put an end to the suffering and launching the FOMASCO movement. And eventually we created the Togolese Civil League as an NGO to be able to raise more support to structure the work we are doing in order to push for change in Togo. Aside that, I also teach at the University of Denver at the Joseph Kober School of International Studies. I teach on civil resistance and parallelly to that as well, I recently joined the Open Technology Fund as a program manager, which is an organization based in Washington, D.C. That is focused on deploying solutions and resources to support tech groups, activist groups, journalists that are creating technology to circumvent government censorship and reduce digital surveillance, especially in countries that are ruled by authoritarian governments. So a lot of my work, both in activism and professionally and even academically, evolve around human rights, civil resistance, civic engagement, and democracy building. And as part of my role at the Togolese Civil League, I have initiated a few programs that include the Gender Justice Program, which aims at supporting victims of physical sexual violence in Togo, and most precisely gender-based violence in Togo that were perpetrated by people in the corridor of power, because they are usually the biggest violators, but then there's no accountability because they're in power and they are the elites and they have the guns and they have the resources. And in addition to that, I launched a separate program called the Gaye Academy, which aims at training as many Togolese citizens as possible about Bitcoin and the role of Bitcoin in not only helping us in our struggle for democracy, but also helping us kind of like find an alternative to the colonial currency that our country has been forced to use since the colonial era. We'll dive more into it in the interview, but that's basically who I am and what I do. I'm an activist full time.
It's a difficult question in a sense to say, summarize everything you do now, because every human is interested in so many topics, right? It's, we're so often actually pigeonholed into, what's your job title, and then that's all that you are. But it's actually an incredibly, it's a silly reflection.
I'm quite lucky that all that I do evolve around the same topics, so they are absolutely all interconnected, interrelated. So it was a long process to get there, but now I am in that space where in every aspect, professional, paraprofessional life, I am evolving around issues regarding human rights, digital rights, as well as democracy.
And so to keep on that subject, it's obviously an incredibly important part of every human society over the history of mankind, right? The idea that people should have the same rights as others. The fact that it's not been achieved to date. There's all sorts of reasons for that. What I'd like to understand is, for those of us, including myself, I confess, who don't know a lot about Togo, could you teach me about the history of the country? And in particular, you're obviously interested in working against the current like status quo system. So what are some of the main problems that you've experienced growing up in a country that is the oldest military regime in Africa? You mentioned, what is that how you described it? um,
Um,
yeah, just tell me a bit more
yes,
about what life was like there, and some of the problems that
I
you face every day as citizens of the country. I mean, maybe you're not allowed to talk about it, I guess. um,
I mean, the question is interesting when you ask what kind of problems we face growing up under a military regime. I think it would be easier to answer what kind of problems we didn't face, because it sounds like the problems are so numerous that listing them will take forever. But I'll give you a quick summary. Togo initially was a German colony. It was inhabited mostly by farmers' communities, some hunters in the north. And eventually the German arrived in Togo in 1985 and they took over. They took over with fierce resistance, of course, from a lot of the ethnic groups in the country, which led to the killing of thousands of them. And then eventually Germany lost World War One, and Togo, as well as all other German colonies in Africa, were literally given to the winners of World War One, considering that the Africans were never consulted in terms of the distribution of their nations and their land. So Togo ended up being given to both France and Britain, because both of them wanted to consolidate their presence in the West African region. France at the time owned the majority of the countries in West Africa, and then Britain was a little scared that if French takes Togo, it's only going to increase their presence even more. So they decided to kind of like to play some games, you know. So they gave 1/3 of Togo to Britain, and then 2/3 of Togo to France. So the British side of Togo, which was called the British Togoland, eventually decided to join Cape Coast to form modern day Ghana. And now it is completely within the borders of Ghana. And the French Togoland, on the other hand, will become the Republic of Togo that we know today, which I was born and raised from. But interestingly, at least 1/3 of the people of Togo have family that are now in modern day Ghana. So there has always been this little bit of conflict. I hear sometimes some Ghanaians complain that, well, you know, when we have elections in Ghana, there are Togolese people who come and vote in our elections. But the reality is that they are dual nationals of Togo and Ghana because of colonialism. As the Ghanaian constitution, for example, states that anybody whose parents or grandparents are born in modern day Ghana is entitled to Ghanaian citizenship. So on that basis, you have a huge number, millions of Togolese who has at least a parent or a grandparent that was born on the west side of the border. So as a result, they are entitled to be Ghanaians. It's not like if they were just Togolese taking over. So colonialism and history play a trick on us. But the most interesting part is that French, they call Togoland, was not considered as a French colony because it was placed under French mandate by the United Nations with the goal of leading Togo to independence in the following 20 years. And France took over in 1919 after Germany lost the war. But even 4 decades later, they didn't want to go. So the Togolese people were like, you know, we are supposed to get our independence. The plan with the United Nations that will actually prepare us to reach our independence, and you don't want to go. So they started organizing against France and to demand independence. And it was years of organizing which led to the arrest of multiple of those independence struggle leaders, including the first president of Togo, Sylvanus Olympio, and many others like my grandfather on my father's side, who was also an activist and spent years in prison demanding independence. And eventually Togo obtained its independence by voting against colonialism in a referendum, the very first referendum held in the French colony on April 28, 1958, which eventually was emulated by other nations like Guinea, etc. So when Togo became independent 2 years after the vote of the referendum, because even after voting no, the French still took a while to depart because they said it needed to get ready. And they imposed a lot of conditions on Togo that the then president was not interested in. Now, Sylvanus Olympio, who was technically who we call the founding father of our nation, he's like the George Washington of Togo, the one who led the independence struggle. He was one of the most educated presidents then. He spoke 6 languages fluently, including 5 European languages. He schooled in what the French consider the Anglo-Saxon world. So Sylvanus Olympio was born in Togo. He went to a German school in primary school. Then he went to a British school in the modern day Ghana, which used to be the British Togoland. Then after that, he furthered his studies in the UK. He went to London School of Economics and he got a degree there. And he started his career working for Unilever, the British company. At some point, he was working at the Nigeria office and he was promoted to being the director of Unilever in Togo, and then eventually head the whole of Africa continent. As a result, the French didn't really see him as being very close to the France because he literally grew up in a non-Francophone environment, while other independence leaders in many other countries that French control were literally groomed by the French in the French system, and they felt as being part of the French elite. And even though they wanted independence, they still were loyal to France to some extent. So Olympio came in and he said, Togo needs to leave the CFA currency. And that particular thing we were never told about the details of the history until I started doing some research and I found some things that made me just blew my mind. So Olympio was deprived of all his civic rights in 1954. So France used to organize some legislative elections in its African colonies and allow each colony to have like 1 or 2 members of parliament that, according to them, can speak on behalf of their people. That's their way of pretending that the colonies also had a say in the way they were being run. So the very first parliamentary elections that took place in Togo were won by the independence leaders. And then after that, the French made sure that they never win again. So the following elections, they operated completely differently. They changed the community leaders, they appointed their own puppets, and they prevented independentists from accessing voting cards. And without those voting cards, they couldn't vote. So their non-independence people ended up being the one winning the second legislative elections. And when the third ones were coming up, and Olympio has quit his job as a director of Unilever to focus entirely on organizing the Togolese masses for independence, they saw him coming and they wanted to prevent him from moving forward. So they arrested Olympio on the basis of him possessing foreign currency. And believe me, I was born and raised in Togo. I was a history major in Togo. There was not a single chapter that anything was told to us about this specific part of our independence. And I'll tell you why. So Olympio was, while working for Unilever, used to be paid in British pound, and he had a bank account in modern day Ghana, which used to be the Togolese, British Togoland. So he wanted to build a house upon his return to Togo to fully embark on the struggle. And he wrote a check to his architect. The architect was arrested by the French at the border. And then Olympio was arrested. He was jailed, detained, placed on foot. After that, he was placed under house arrest. And they said he could no longer have the right to vote or partake in any elections in Togo. And for them, that was the way for them to prevent Olympio from doing that, from leading Togo one day. But when the Togolese still went ahead and did the referendum and the independence leaders won, even though Olympio was not the candidate, the independence leaders said, we don't put the hat on the knee when the head is there. So Olympio is the head, and he's the one who organized us. He's the one we want as a leader. And now that we are independent, we get to choose our leader anyway. So they decided that Olympio will be the president of Togo. And this guy became president without even being elected technically himself. but his leadership led to him becoming president at that. So Olympio understood pretty quickly that the monetary policies that were imposed by France were completely undermining and absolutely abusive. So upon independence, the French cited a list of things that we had to restitute to them. And they came with a long list of obligations. And this is something that they actually copied from their past in Haiti. When Haiti fought for its independence, becoming the first Black nation in the world, the French said they have to pay them back for every single Black Haitians in that country because they were slaves, and they have to buy those slaves back for $3 each. And they calculated everything they said they have lost in Haiti, and they have to be refunded. So technically, you come and colonize us, and we have to refund you for your loss for colonizing us.
Wow.
And when Haiti refused, they imposed very severe embargoes on Haiti. And it made Haiti pay them back what would be considered today's modern day $50 billion, which is huge for such a tiny country.
Yeah.
Eventually, because of the embargo, Haiti could no longer sell its crops abroad. Its economy was doing very poorly, and eventually they gave in and started paying back France. So France came with the same model in Africa and said, you have to refund us all the roads we built, the ports we built, all the trains, stations, and the railroads. You have to refund all the hospitals, all the schools, all the money we invested that we couldn't reap all the benefits. You have to refund us this, and they call it the colonial debt. So they wrote a whole thing that they call a Pacte Colonial. The Pacte Colonial say that, first of all, we have to refund everything. Number two, we have to sign a military pact with France, which means that whenever our countries, according to them, feel threatened, the French military has to intervene to protect its interests in the country. That's number two. Number three, we must use the colonial currency, the CFA currency, which the French imposed on us. And that CFA currency was built copying a model that the Nazi invented during World War II. So during World War II, the Nazi created a currency that it imposed on all the countries it occupied in Europe in order to be able to control the economy and to prevent them from printing money so that they can fund the war. So the French imposed the same country, and all its colonies in Africa, there was 14 of them, 17 of them actually at the time, they must absolutely use that currency. Olympio, in addition to that, the French has the first right of say on all our imports and exports. So technically, Togo produces phosphate and other natural resources such as cocoa and coffee, iron, and many more, as well as all the other countries that produce uranium in Niger, petrol, gas in Chad and Congo, bauxite in Guinea. We have the obligation of only selling to France, and it's only after the French companies have turned it down that we can seek another buyer. We also have the obligation to procure from France for all our public service needs. And it's funny that in our country, we're still the only ones whose governments order Renault and Peugeot, which are French brands, car brands. We don't order from Americans or the Japanese or the Germans.
No way. Yeah.
So it was literally colonialism just on paper. Technically, you want independence, we give it to you, but we still control everything. So Olympio said this is just crap. We want our own currency because with the CFA currency, all the nations have the obligation of keeping 80% of their gold reserve in the Bank of France. So what does it mean? They say they keep the first 65% as because they have the right to print the money as the reserve, and then they add another 15% to counter what they call inflation. So when the money inflates, then they can literally manage it by printing more or printing less. So technically, they keep 80% of our gold. So when we need money, unlike other countries that are independent, like the US federal government, when they need more money, the Federal Reserve will just issue more bonds. It's wealth creation on debt. And then people buy the bonds, the government collect the money, they invest in the economy. We have to we can't do that. We just have to go and borrow, take a loan from France with interest. Even though they have our money, they have like 60% of our reserve, we still have to borrow it from them and pay it with interest. So Olympio said we want our own monetary independence. And Olympio wasn't the only one. The president of Guinea before then also decided that he wanted his own money, which he created, but the French gave him hell. That's another story, because they eventually printed billions of that money in fake money, and they invested it in the economy and brought the franc Guinean completely down. But when you look at Togo specifically, Olympio in 1962, since Togo was created, he had a plan of creating the Togo's currency. So on December 12, 1962, he sent a bill. The Togolese parliament voted a bill to create the franc Togolais. Exactly 1 month later, on the night of January 12 to January 13, 1963, the French sent former soldiers of the French colonial army that are Togolese, because the French had over 300,000 troops in Africa, and these were people who were recruited, actually abducted, because my maternal grandfather coincidentally was a colonial soldier. They were abducted to serve the French army during World War II and even during World War I. So all the European countries did that. So they sent these soldiers to go to Olympio's house and assassinate him. And after assassinating him, they put his brother-in-law, who happened to be pro-France and who was the former prime minister of Togo under the French rule, they made him president. 3 years down the line, the Togolese realized that nothing has changed, that Nicolas Grunitzky, the brother-in-law of Olympio, literally has just completely brought back French colonialism. When he became president, all the pro-independence activists, including my grandfather, were jailed. They were kept in prison, they were beaten and tortured, and so much because they wanted to prevent them from being able to reorganize against the French. And in 1963, towards November, the Togolese people rose again for a second revolution. And they said, now we don't want the French. This is not why we voted for independence. Even if Olympio died, we must go to elections and choose a new president. We can't just impose Grunitzky on us. And the protest was severely repressed. Thousands were killed and things were getting out of control. So because the French were afraid that if they don't intervene, the independence leaders will come back and kick them out again, they sent these same soldiers to do a second coup to remove Olympio's brother-in-law, Nicolas Grunitzky, and to make now one of those soldiers the president of Togo, whose name is Eyadema Gnassingbé. First of all, they put another one called Clement Dajo. He was the first one when they removed Grunitzky on January 14, 1964. But then Clement Dajo, who was the head of the army then, he was a huge drunkard and he couldn't control anything. So the French sent another one in the colonial army to topple him 3 months later on April 14, 1967. And Eyadema was the one, and he was among those who killed Sylvanus Olympio. He became president. He was a complete illiterate. The French chose him specifically because he was a brute. He was trained to be a butcher, to be one of the worst killers in the colonial army. He was not educated, so he couldn't have that intellectual appeal to want to secede from France. He's extremely loyal to France. And when he came in, he said clearly that he didn't want to be president, but de Gaulle asked him. De Gaulle was the president of France then. De Gaulle asked him to stay there, and he is loyal to de Gaulle. De Gaulle is his boss. So Eyadema became president, and he ended up ruling Togo for 38 years. And it was 38 years of hell, 38 years of activists, dissidents being arrested, killed, their bodies dumped in the lakes, in the sea, intellectuals, university professors, even high school students being killed and tortured. This led thousands of Togolese fleeing the country to exile, and there were several attempts to organize revolutions, but they were never successful. Eyadema was extremely brutal. Under him, it was the patrol, the military was everywhere in the city. You don't leave your house after 7 p.m. or you can get killed, because there was a constant curfew in the country. Protests were banned. There was only one political party, the one built by Eyadema himself. He was the only candidate in every single elections, and of course, he won by 100%. It was literally a banana republic until he died in 2005. And mind you, the same day he died, in the evening of his death, the army came on national TV and announced that his son, who was his minister then, was appointed president of Togo, even though the constitution says that the presidency has to be taken by the head of the National Assembly. They kick him out and they put his son Faure Gnassingbé there. And when Faure Gnassingbé became president, the Togolese resisted, and one of his siblings, who was Minister of Defense then, Pacha Gnassingbé, now in prison because he tried to topple his brother a few years down the line, Pacha Gnassingbé said, if I have to work on the skull of every single Togolese for my brother to be president, I will not hesitate. And that's exactly what they did. When the Togolese tried to resist this forceful takeover, they killed over thousands of them within just a matter of a couple of days. According to the UN investigations, they concluded that at least 500 were killed, but those investigations were conducted in an atmosphere where people were asked to come and testify. And how do you go and tell about your family being killed by people who are still in power and who are literally running the whole process? So there were over 1,000 who were killed. It was the most violent elections in our history. And he has continued ruling in the same terror, abusing citizens, depriving citizens of their rights, jailing journalists, jailing activists, killing children. Because in Togo in 2013, we had students held a protest demanding that their teachers who were on strike return to school, and they opened fire on those kids, killing children as young as 9-year-old in primary school, simply because they were in uniform and came, we want our teachers back. And just last year, they arrested over dozens of students for the same thing because they came out to protest because their teachers were on strike. So in Togo, literally, being a child is you protesting for the right to have an education and could even get killed for that. I always say that the only freedom you have in Togo is the freedom to die. You can choose to get killed or to just die, but nothing else works for this region. Any form of protest is banned in the country, regardless of the sector, whether it is in education, in health sector, in agriculture, labor rights. They don't tolerate any form of protest at all because they're afraid that eventually it's going to lead to something bigger than that. So they try to kill it in the night, and they do so very brutally. So the Togolese have been living in that atmosphere of fear for many decades. We live in a country where people, when Eyadema himself was president, you dare not say his name in public. I always make this joke, which is actually true. I became fascinated by Harry Potter as a teenager when I was about 12, simply because after reading the first one, I realized that Voldemort sounded everything like Eyadema. I mean, you will say Eyadema's name at home and my mom will spank you. You don't pronounce his name.
He who must
anywhere,
not be named.
not even in your room. Yes, people have nicknames for him. They'll call him the baobab tree, the old man, the guy, but they will never say his name because there were spies everywhere. And anybody could go and report you and say you have criticized the president, and then you and your family are just completely wiped out. So people were extremely cautious and extremely afraid.
Wow. Farida, well, I'm now much more in tune with what's happened in Togo. Thank you so much for explaining all of that. You've obviously spent a lot of time, not just, of course, being taught by your family as to what happened historically, but also researching it yourself. Thank you for speaking up and for teaching us about this. I'm immediately interested to ask, like, by even having this conversation now, like, are you under any kind of threat from the existing regime in Togo? And you've obviously made a decision that you're not happy with the way things are being run and you want to do something about it. So what kind of position does that put you in?
I always say that in Togo, sorry.
It's okay.
I think I've talked so much I became thirsty. So in Togo, being a citizen itself is a threat.
Wow. Wow.
The government just don't want us to be citizens. They want us to be people who live there. But being a citizen, meaning having rights or demanding rights, is absolutely a threat to the government. They don't want us to have a say in anything. They don't want us to complain about anything. And I always make an analogy as an activist, of course, trying to mobilize people by telling them that those who get killed by the consequences of poor governance and dictatorship outnumber those who actually get killed because they have spoken against the regime. Because we have people who are dying, as the country is one of the poorest on the planet. You go to our hospitals, you don't have bed. You see mommies delivers babies on the bare floor. Premature babies not having the equipment to be placed in NICU. They are held in carton boxes. The majority of them die. The roads are so poor that people have accidents constantly. People dying of inability to access clean water. The corruption is so high because the regime rules the country as a family business. Eyadema appointed his children to occupy every single state agency, and they treat it as their private inheritance, and they loot everything. As a result, in such conditions, every Togolese is actually under threat of something. But now, narrowing it down to my activism, of course, when I initially launched the Formasco movement in 2011, I was 20. And it came with a severe backlash because I was the only known face of the movement. I came out and I read the speech about the movement, our goal to bring down the regime. So we gave him an ultimatum of 60 days to leave power. I read the speech 60 days before our Independence Day on February 27, 2011, and we say we give you 60 days to go. If you don't go on April 27, which is Togo's independence 2011, we are going to fight you and we will use every single resources available to us to bring you down. And we really meant it because we were just fed up. So of course that came with a severe backlash, a lot of threats, a lot of abuse. I was living with my siblings, then they kicked me out. People like, we don't want to have anything to do with you again. There are some family members that I have not spoken to or been in touch with since that period because they don't want to have anything to do with me again. There are friends that I lost because they're like, I mean, being against the regime in Togo and openly is already a problem. Nobody wants to be a friend, but when you openly come and assume it, and back in the days, I was the very first activist that came online to make that kind of statement on video. Many of the activists back then were using fake names and fake IDs. So it was a terrifying move for the most. People are like, what is she even counting on? Does she even know how dangerous these people are? The Togolese government tried everything they could do. They called my university, asked them to expel me. Thank God I was studying in the United States, so they couldn't do that. But it came with a heavy toll. I eventually faced a lot. And I don't like sharing about it a lot because there's the trauma there, and there's also the fear that it's going to lead other people of being afraid. And I don't want to be the kind of person that people will be saying, this is what they did to Farida when she got involved, so let's not do it. I want to inspire people to keep doing it. So I force myself to be strong for others by not showing that hurt and that pain and that trauma and that violence that I have sustained for over a decade. But it became, my life was constantly under threat. And then at some point I decided to return to Togo, and I did. And I did it in a very technical, strategic way at a period where I knew they didn't have the option of doing something to me. I literally scheduled my trip to coincide with a major international event that the government put so much time in organizing, an international conference. And then I said, well, I'm actually going to come to your conference, and if you have the gut to arrest me, just arrest me. And then the whole world will know, because they are all here, all the world leaders and then the world famous journalists, they'll know that you actually arrested an activist for speaking against your poor governance. So it was a moment of a show that I went there and I did my show, and there was nothing they could do because they were being watched. But then eventually I went under the radars, and following a lot of pressure from families and friends, I ended up leaving the country again because they were extremely terrified. And it came to a point where I realized that my presence were also putting their own lives at risk. At some point, there was a military truck parked in front of my parents' house 24/7. Thinking that I would come to the house and they could fetch me. Of course, I wasn't that stupid, but they expected that silliness anyway. But following that, I went to exile. The first country that I went to tried to kick me out. They literally invited me for questioning, and they said, your government is asking us to have you go. If you don't go, we reserve the right to return you because we can't allow you to create diplomatic tension between both countries. So I left there and I went to another one. Then it became a cycle of moving from one country to another. Constantly, the threat was there. Some of them were fake alerts, some of them were real ones. So it was moments that were difficult, but it was moments that I was able to manage and handle thanks to two things. Number one, to the fact that I was a daughter of an activist. And my dad shared with me how there were times of tensions where they were protesting in Togo in the early 90s, where the government were after all of them that were considered as being activists against the regime. So my dad, unlike many of his friends, refused to leave the country. Most of them fled the country for their safety. Otherwise, whenever they were arrested, they were killed. They were either burned to death or they were killed and dumped in the sea. So he actually survived by moving from one house to another. He wouldn't spend more than 2 nights in the same house, in the same neighborhood. So that's how he managed to be invisible and to keep going for years. So knowing that from my dad's experience, I decided to do the same thing, but not at a national level, more at the African level. So I was moving from one country to another. And I was able to do so as well because I had a very strong community of support of African activists from all over the continent. When I was based in DC as a student, I was an organizer of African diaspora activists fighting against dictatorships. We held protests against all the dictatorships you can think of in Africa, and I led a coalition of activists as well for several years. As a result, those activists, some of these countries were luckily freed from their dictators, even though Togo is still there. So they were in solidarity with our struggle, and with me particularly, because they considered me as a sister in the struggle. So when I need to go to their country, I just call, and I'm like, I want to go to Nigeria. What do I do? And they tell me who to go, who to meet with, where to stay, and they support me. In some countries, they even hosted me for months. I didn't have to pay a single thing. They literally pampered me. They protected me. They came with their full support, their network, their resources, their media. They helped me as much as they could. So that's how I was able to survive and have been able to continue this activism till date.
Wow. There's so many questions I want to ask you, Farida, but in general, I tried to keep these to an hour-long conversation. I feel like we could do 3 hours, no problem. But the purpose of these podcasts is to talk about Bitcoin. And that's where I'd like to steer the specific conversation at this point, even though there's so many questions I'd love to ask about your experiences and what you've just explained. But I think it's really important to recognize some of the history you've explained, and the CFA, for example, and how France basically installed a puppet government that was enabled by their kind of international policies to behave in horrible ways to citizens of Togo, but it was done using money, basically. So can you teach us a bit about why Bitcoin's important when you work as an activist, and how that's going to change things going forwards?
Okay. I will start by the practical side of Bitcoin. We live in a country where when you are an activist, automatically the government watches everything you do. There are countless of activists. And I know this because it happened to my father as well, whose bank accounts are just frozen with no notice by the government. Opposition leaders, dissidents, they will just freeze their accounts and confiscate their money because they say they want to use the money against them. Businesses that will just be shut down completely with no remorse, no consequences, simply because the person who owns the business is the friend or the family member of a dissident or has supported a dissident. We currently have in prison one political prisoner whose name is Aziz Goma, who has been so severely tortured that he can no longer walk. He has spent the 3 years in prison. He has lost over 40% of his body weight simply because he donated the equivalent of $100 to pay for the hotel room of some protesters who visited from a different city. He himself is not an activist. And there are countless of people who were ruined, whose wealth were destroyed, whose resources were confiscated simply because of that. We live in a country where the government is extremely paranoid. They don't just arrest you on the suspicion of you committing a crime or you organizing against them. They also arrest you on the suspicion that somebody you know actually is doing something against them, which is why people are so fearful of each other and their friendships and their relationships. So for us, the Bitcoin was the number one alternative for activists, for organizers and activists and people in general, because it doesn't just happen to Togolese activists, it happens to everyone who is in Togo. You can randomly help someone without even knowing the person is an activist. And then the person goes around and the government find out they're an activist, and they find out you gave them money maybe 2 years ago and they come and they arrest you. Why did you give them the money? You probably give them the money to fight us, and it has nothing to do with that. So I said, saving your money in Bitcoin actually help you protect your money from them when they come for you, because you never know when they will come for you. And there are so many people they go after for so little things, because they just can't seize your Bitcoin assets unless you give them the access to it, information and access to it. That's number one. Number two, because of this tight control, the majority of the protests and the organizing that takes place in Togo were conducted thanks to the support of the Togolese diaspora. Togo has over 2 million citizens living abroad. For a country of 8 million people, 2 million living abroad, technically we represent about 1/4 of the population. So the diaspora is so strong, and they are the one, and many of them actually fled dictatorship, so they are almost all anti the regime, and they fund citizens organizing in the country. So the regime, knowing that, has put in many measures to prevent the diaspora from giving money to the citizens movement, and have arrested some people when they returned back home simply because they donated money to dissidents. So this has actually created an atmosphere of fear again from people in the diaspora by thinking that if I give money, my family or I can get in trouble because the government will find out about it. So with Bitcoin, we give them a different alternative by saying you can actually send Bitcoin and they wouldn't even know it was you. Nobody will know it was you. It's between you and the receiver. It can be peer-to-peer. So that solves another problem for us operating under a dictatorial government. Now, I'm going to descend from the practical side of it to the philosophical side of it. I always say that Bitcoin is the currency of decolonization. Why? Because the currency we use in Togo today was a currency of colonization. It was created specifically to control our resources, to control our economy, to prevent us from having independent economies and monetary systems. As a result, we are paid in a currency that is worth nothing. The CFA currency has lost over 200% of its value since its creation. The French will just wake up one day and say, your money is worth 50% less than what it used to be. And this has impoverished so many people. So you have citizens working hard and being paid in a currency that, first of all, cannot be converted to any other currency in the world. It used to be pegged on the French currency, now it's pegged on the euro. So before we can even change the Togolese CFA to the Naira, you have to change it to the US dollar first before using the US dollar to go and buy the Naira, or the cedi in Ghana, and we are neighboring countries, when the majority of the trades actually happens between those countries. So you have a lot of money trading happening in the black market because of this, because at the bank level, you can do that. And the fees are extremely high. So you may end up losing up to 15 to 20% of your money simply because you want to purchase goods from your neighboring country, which even a few years ago was not even a neighboring country, it was still your country because of colonialism. So Bitcoin is a currency that does not limit us to the colonial borders and the colonial currencies. We have a continent of 54 nations and 42 currencies. With Bitcoin, we are technically eliminating the existence of these multiple currencies on the continent. It makes trade among Africans easier. Then you have the aspect of remittances. In Togo, for example, remittances from the diaspora represent 10% of our GDP. Almost every single family relies on a member in the diaspora to feed, to pay for school fees, to pay for healthcare. And we send money through those remittances. Not only the fees are high, the conversion rate is never the same. So you send $500 and you may end up losing up to $40 over those $500. So it also reduces those fees. So at the end of the day, I say that Bitcoin gives us access for the first time to a global financial market. We don't have to be Americans to use the American dollars, or we don't have to go to the United States to use the United States dollars. With the Bitcoin, for example, it's not money that belongs to Americans or money that belongs to the British or money that belongs to the French, where you feel like by using this money, I'm only making the Americans richer or I'm only making the French richer. It is money that belongs to the world. And for me, it is the first time that a currency has been created for humanity. And this is no longer a currency that was built with the intention of subjugating others and controlling them and impoverish them. It's actually a currency that is supposed to do the opposite, to free them from the existing banking system, colonial system, imperialistic system, and an economic system that have maintained millions in poverty for decades. So I don't go ahead and tell people Bitcoin is going to make you rich. Buy $100 in 2 months, it's going to become $200 and sell it. No, I tell people Bitcoin is going to fluctuate. Some days it will be strong, sometimes it will be very low. But then we use Bitcoin as an act of resistance against colonialism. So it is a sacrifice that we choose to accept so that eventually the world can be freed, or at least our countries can be freed from the colonial systems and the monetary systems that have kept us in bondage and in poverty for many decades. So it is an ideology and a philosophy in itself.
It's an amazing, amazing, amazing technology, isn't it? Your story is so compelling, Farida, and it makes a total mockery of the people that you can, you know, the amount of friends and family that will send me a message, you know, with a news article that says Bitcoin's crashed, it creates no value, it's a Ponzi, and the use case you've just described for, you know, the money of the world, it couldn't be clearer. It's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. And so perhaps we could dive in a little more into the day-to-day of how this feels. So Bitcoin's only 12, 13 years old. Every year it grows stronger. Every month, every day, more people adopt it, and it's being used in different places, and people become accustomed to it. So do you see like the adoption rates, for example, picking up hugely in places like Togo? And how do you see that kind of everyday usage of it changing over time? Because it seems to me that someone like yourself that has a history of, well, yourself, you're an activist, your father, your grandfathers on both sides, there's clearly been deep frustrations and, you know, some arguably evil stuff going on in the lands that you're, you know, growing up in. And suddenly this money comes along that at least will ease some of the difficulties that have been placed on your people. But it's all about usage. It's all about adoption. So is that rapidly picking up and people are becoming more and more comfortable using it? How do you see that changing?
Okay, I will have to make a quick rectification. Both my grandparents were activists. My dad's dad was an activist, but my mom's dad was actually a soldier in the colonial army.
Okay.
However, answering your question, do I see Bitcoin being adopted in Togo? On the latest chain analysis publication last year of the countries with the highest Bitcoin adoption rate, Togo is number 9. Togo is in the top 10 countries where Bitcoin adoption is the highest in the world. We are number 9, the second in Africa, right after Nigeria.
Wow.
To tell you that people are not even waiting to be told to go for it. They are already going for it. For those who live in countries where the government, the state institutions are powerful, where the currency is regulated by the state and it is powerful, and they're not worried that their $100 today will be worth $20 tomorrow, for them, Bitcoin is just a regular Ponzi scheme, or I don't know, a lottery, a speculative thing. For people who live in countries where you have no ID, you have about 40, 60% of the population that don't even have a birth certificate. As a result, they don't even have an ID. And as a consequence of that, they don't even have a bank account. And everything they do, they have to do it cash. Bitcoin provides a technical and practical alternative. For people living in countries where the government can just confiscate your wealth with no consequences because there's no rule of law, you can't even sue them, or you may end up getting killed and you're told to forget about it. Bitcoin offers a safer alternative to fiat money. For people living in countries where they have to send money to their families back home to sustain their life, and they realize that over 10% of that money is being taken away by middle institutions, Bitcoin is a way of reducing those fees and those burdens on them. So I always say that people who look down on Bitcoin do it out of two things: either complete ignorance or coming from a position of privilege. They don't understand because they cannot imagine, and a regular American cannot imagine that there are people who can't just have bank accounts because their birth has never been recorded. They can't prove that they exist. This is the kind of lack of infrastructural things we have. So people in countries like that are fastly adopting Bitcoin because they have to. It's offering them an alternative. It's giving them an option that the system didn't eventually did for them. So now we have those who are called the unbanked population can now become what I call the Bitcoin population. They can now be part of an economy without needing to go through a long process of proving through a judge that they were eventually really born in a specific country to deserve its citizenship. And finally, when you look at Africa, in 2020 and 21, Africa has been the continent with the fastest Bitcoin adoption rates in the world. We are a country of 1.3 billion people, and we have the fastest adoption Bitcoin rate in the world. In 2021 alone, the adoption rate of Bitcoin in Africa exceeded 100% from the previous year. It has more than doubled. So why are Africans going into Bitcoin? We're a country, of course, you have a few who are like rich, but the majority are poor. They cannot afford to just put $10,000 or $20,000 and then sit and sleep and wait for it to rise. They are actually using it to solve daily problems, to buy goods, to purchase resources, to send money to family members, to hide money from the government, to support activism against authoritarian regimes, and many other things. So yes, it's not that I'm seeing a Bitcoin growing in Togo or everywhere else in Africa. It's already happening, and it's not even requiring. It's happening in a very genuine way, not requiring people to be told to do it, but they are actually doing. But what the Gaia Academy, my organization, does is to ensure that people have the right information, because there's also a lot of scamming that is happening in this atmosphere, and a lot of people don't even know that they can buy their own Bitcoin. They think they have to go to someone who will buy it for them, or so teaching them how they can buy it, how they can secure it, how they can sell it, those little details to make it safer for them, so that they don't end up hating the money, the Bitcoin itself, when they were the one who didn't do due diligence before giving their money to a scammer. I always say, it's not because somebody took $10,000 from you and scammed you in investing $10,000 in a Ponzi that it is the dollars that is the Ponzi. It's not the Bitcoin that is the Ponzi. It is the side Ponzi businesses that people create around it to scam ignorant people. So the solution is to educate people, not to actually hate on the currency itself. The currency is not the problem.
Yeah, and Bitcoin education is well, largely one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast, but such an important part of any new technology is understanding what it is, teaching people how to use it. And ultimately it's a tool. Like mobile phones are a tool. Your cooking knife is a tool. The internet is a tool. Obviously how people use it is subject to the user's intentions. Yes, you know, there will be people who have nefarious plans using Bitcoin, but hey, the US dollar is currently doing a lot more criminal behavior than any
Absolutely.
Bitcoin even does, right? So
When
it's,
you look at the World Bank's publication on the corruption and illicit financial flights in the world, the money coming from like the part of corruption and crimes that are conducted using Bitcoin and other crypto represent less than 1% of the whole of the corruption that happens in the world. So technically, it's not even close.
wow. That's
The
hilarious, isn't it?
Yeah,
Bitcoin's
yes,
for criminals.
the
Not
amount
so
of money
much.
that is lost in crimes and corruption annually, according to the World Bank, amounts to $1.2 trillion.
Wow.
And the amount of money that is lost in Bitcoin amounts to about $3 billion. So
Wow.
1.3 trillion and then 3 billion. It's not even 1%. But then they are dead and painting Bitcoin as being the money for the cameras and the thieves. If you want money as a criminal, you don't want to put it on a chain that is immutable, that is recorded for a lifetime. You want to do it completely invisibly. People confuse privacy with secrecy. Bitcoin is a private money. It's not a secret money. There are secret money laundering systems out there that our states are using, that our government officials are using, and they are getting away with it. Many reports have exhibited how they have been doing that. They didn't launder those money in Bitcoin. They will not do that. Yeah.
And it also, of course, begs the question of what is criminal. You mentioned the story of France still controls 80% of Togo's gold, and that the only way to exchange the CFA for any other currency is via their FX system that effectively takes 15 to 20% of your value, not taking into account the inflation rate of some 200% you mentioned. So, like, what's criminal? The fact that whoever set the system up gets to keep all of the raw material, which is actually valuable, aka the gold, and builds a paper system on top of that it forces every citizen to use, that it controls to such an extent their cronies that run the on ramps and off ramps create 10-15% every time. And actually, if they feel like creating more of it, guess what? We just printed it and there's nothing you can do about it. And you go, whoa, okay. I never expected to be having this conversation with you today, but when you start peeling back these stories, it's quite extraordinary how money through history has been used to control people, to accrete wealth to those that are in power.
Absolutely.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Well, Farida, listen, 1 hour has flown by. Thank you so much for sharing everything today. I've absolutely loved hearing your story, and I'm sure we will speak again in the future. The last question I have is just where can people reach out to you if they want to help or to get in touch with you?
Yeah, they can always reach out on Twitter. I'm easily accessible there. My handle is at Farida_N, or just search my name.
Okay, cool. Well, Farida, thanks so much for taking the time to have this conversation.
The pleasure was mine. Thank you, Jake.
Thank you.